Thanks. So this is joint work with Mukund, Raghotaman, Rajeev, Alur, Zachary, Ives, and Sanjeev, Khanna. This work is about data stream processing, and the setting is that of an unbounded source of data that produces data items in real time and at a very high rate. And the specific challenge in the streaming setting is the volume and velocity of the data. It is just too much to store and process offline, so the processing has to be done on the fly. And I guess another important aspect is that the insights that are derived from immediate processing are much more valuable compared to delayed processing. And there are many real-time healthcare and finance applications where the processing has to be practically instantaneous for the results to have any value whatsoever. So for this work, we proposed the StreamQRE language, which consists of a small and expressive set of core abstractions for stream processing. More specifically, it combines regular expressions, numerical aggregations, and features of relational languages in order to facilitate the modular description of practical computations. Moreover, a high-level query can be compiled into streaming executable code with precise efficiency guarantees. And I will also discuss how the StreamQRE engine has been validated experimentally for good performance by comparison with other engines. So the running example for this talk is inspired from the domain of patient monitoring. So assume we have a group of patients with sensors attached to them that measure some kind of significant physiological quantity. And every measurement that is produced is also annotated with a patient identifier, which specifies the patient the measurement came from, and is sent to a server to be further processed. And we would like to monitor the health of our patients, so we want to implement the following query. Every second, compute the set of the patients who are currently experiencing some kind of atypical episode, which I define to mean as an episode that is of unusual intensity for the specific patient. And one important observation here is that this query is stateful. In order to compute that, we need to maintain some kind of state that summarizes the past, and we need to be able to update the state every time we receive a new data item. And another aspect is the quantitative part. So the computation crucially depends on calculating some numerical aggregates on the stream history. And the question becomes, how do we specify and evaluate such queries? And of course, one approach would be to use a general purpose programming language, but this requires that the programmer figures out exactly what state to maintain and how to update that state with the arrival of every new data item. Moreover, the programmer has to figure out how to compute the final output from the state that they maintain. And I argue that this is cumbersome and can easily get very error-prone, and also does not facilitate the modular description of a complex computation from simpler ones. So what is a good set of high-level abstractions so that we can easily describe computations like the one I gave as examples? So I argue that the first abstraction that I want here is the ability to partition my stream on the basis of patient identifier and focus on the substream for each patient separately. Then I would like to be able to view the whole substream for a patient as a sequence of disjoint episodes. And finally, I would like to compute the average intensity of the past episodes and compare it to the intensity of the current episode. So our work is about the design of a high-level language for stream processing. And the first aspect is the choice of the programming abstractions. I guess here we want a small language that is expressive and also has a formal mathematical semantics. But there is also the aspect of turning a query into efficient executable code. And specifically for the streaming setting, there are hard resource constraints. In particular, we would like to minimize the time we need to process each data item, and we would also like to minimize the total space used by the algorithm. And ideally, both these key resources should be constant or logarithmic in the length of the stream. Okay, so there is an enormous amount of existing work on stream processing that tackles various aspects of the subject. There are various proposals, I call them state-based formalisms, that usually focus on the problem of pattern matching on streams. There is also a huge literature on the so-called streaming algorithms. I guess the distinctive feature of that literature is that they focus on very specific computational problems, and they try to give small space solutions that typically use both approximation and randomization. There are also various proposals for extensions of relational database languages and systems to the streaming setting. And in many of these works, there is a lot of focus on windowing constructs in order to split the unbounded stream into finite tables that can be further processed. And there is also a very large and growing body of proposals and systems for distributed stream processing that are of industrial strength. So the starting point of our proposal is that many interesting computations rely on some kind of regular hierarchical structure that the stream possesses. For example, think of the substream for a single patient, which consists of just a sequence of measurements, and I partition those measurements into the normal measurements, which I denote with blue boxes, and the abnormal measurements that I denote with red boxes. So here, the first level of grouping would be to define an episode as a sequence of abnormal measurements. But then at a higher level, the entire stream should be viewed as a sequence of disjoint episodes. And I argue that regular expressions are a very natural match in order to describe this hierarchical decomposition of the stream into disjoint episodes. But we also need some kind of quantitative extension of regular expressions in order to be able to express computations such as what is the maximum of the average episode measurement of all episodes, over all episodes we have seen so far. Okay, so this table summarizes our proposed language, which is called StreamQRE and stands for Streaming Quantitative Regular Expressions. We have a quantitative analog for every regular combinator. For example, atomic corresponds to an expression for a single item, split corresponds to concatenation, iter corresponds to Kleene star, or is like non-deterministic choice, and combine is sort of like intersection. And the language is additionally extended with some constructs that are specific to the streaming setting, in particular streaming composition, in order to be able to describe pipelines of processing stages, and key-base partitioning to describe the independent computation of subsets of the stream that are inherently disjoint. So the basic object of our formalism is the query, which describes a transformation from the input stream to the output stream. And more specifically, a query denotes a mapping from a sequence of data items of type D to an output value of type C. So it has a denotational semantics as a partial function from D star to C. And a key notion here is what I call the rate of the query, which is the subset of D star for which the query is defined. And the idea is that the query produces output whenever the history of the stream matches the rate. So assume, for example, that I have a query F that is supposed to emit output exactly when each episode ends. So what is the rate of this query? It's the set of stream histories that end with a red measurement followed by a blue measurement. Okay, so ITER, as I said before, is the quantitative analog of clean star, and it's one of the most commonly used operations. So we use it to describe the repetition of a query sequentially and the aggregation of the intermediate results produced by this query by folding them from left to right. And in order to fold them, we also specify an initial aggregate C and a binary aggregation operation op. So how is this used? Suppose I have already written a query F that returns the duration of just one episode, then the iteration of F with the operation max computes the maximum duration of all episodes we have seen so far. Okay, and the diagram is meant to visualize that. So F produces the intermediate results that are folded from left to right using the max aggregation. So what is the rate of iter of F? It is the iteration of rate of F. And here there is one key typing restriction that we impose on iteration. So we demand that the star of rate of F is unambiguous. So what is this meant to enforce is that there is only one way to split the input stream so that each part matches F. Okay, now split is the quantitative analog of concatenation, and we use split in order to execute queries in sequence and combine the intermediate results using some combination operation. So if I have written a query F that computes the average episode duration and a query G that computes the duration of a single episode, then split FG with the comparison operation greater than checks if the current episode is longer than the average duration of all past episodes. Okay, and the diagram shows this computation. So F matches the segment of the input stream that corresponds to all past episodes. G matches the segment of the stream that corresponds to the current episode, and split FG combines those results using the comparison function. Now, the rate of split FG is simply the concatenation of the rate of F and the rate of G. And again, we have a key typing restriction here. So we only allow split to be used when the concatenation of the rates of F and G is unambiguous. And again, this is to be understood that there is a unique way to split the stream into two parts so that the left part matches F and the right part matches G. Okay, now combination is sort of like intersection. We use it to execute two queries F and G in parallel and combine the results at the end using a combination operation. So if the query F computes the average episode duration and the query G computes the average time between episodes, then the combination of F and G with division just computes the ratio of these values. All right, and here the typing restriction for combination is that the rates of F and G have to be equal, which means that they are both defined on exactly the same set of input histories. And of course, the rate of combination is equal to that rate. So what is the final construct I want to discuss? So this doesn't have an analog in regular expressions. It's key-based partitioning, which is some kind of streaming variant of MapReduce. So we use it to partition the stream by a specified key, then execute a per-key computation on each substream, and finally collect all the results in a table. But in order for this description to make sense, I also need to somehow describe when the output is supposed to be emitted. And in order to specify that, I'm going to assume that the input stream is instrumented with special symbols. I call them punctuations or synchronization markers. And then I specify when to emit output by giving a regular expression in terms of these punctuation symbols. So for my patient example stream, assume that I'm showing my patients with different colors, and I have this special hexagon symbol that indicates the end of a minute, then I can describe the computation every 2 minutes, output the average measurement for each patient. And this key-based partitioning can naturally describe this computation by specifying as key the patient identifier, as per key computation the averaging, and as the rate of the query a regular expression that says output has to be given every second marker. And one important observation that I want to make at this point is that just these regular constructs that I described before are enough to encode many common transformations that appear in stream processing. And I guess the simplest one is filter, that allows us to remove elements that do not satisfy a given predicate, mapping that transforms an input stream by applying a function element-wise, and even more interestingly, we can also express several flavors of windowing constructs. For example, tumbling or consecutive non-overlapping windows, sliding or overlapping windows, windows that are based on the count of the elements, or windows that are based on time. So I think it's kind of interesting that all these operations, windowing operations that are about splitting the stream into finite parts are all expressible within the regular framework of StreamQRE and can be easily incorporated and combined arbitrarily with all the rest of the operations. So we have seen now the most interesting operations of the language. I guess the main point I want to make here is that the StreamQRE language is extremely economical. It consists of just 7 core constructs, and I'd like you to contrast that with ReactiveX, which is also a language for stream processing that contains dozens and dozens of primitive operations, all of which are relatively inexpressive and also easily expressible using the StreamQRE constructs. So let's move now to the aspect of how a query described in the StreamQRE language can be transformed into efficient code. And here, the main theorem is a strong efficiency guarantee that says that the space and processing time per element that we need to evaluate core QREs, let's say now without the map collect construct, is quadratic in the size of the query and independent of the length of the stream. And the caveat here is that I'm assuming that all data operations need unit time and all data types need unit space. And the proof of this fact is quite elaborate. And I want to stress that it's not just regular parsing where you throw in some numerical aggregations. So the StreamQRE language inherently is non-deterministic, and that means that we need to maintain several possibilities for future output results. So this means that the algorithm has to maintain several partial expressions and combine them appropriately as more and more input keeps arriving. And the efficiency guarantee that we obtain, it relies crucially on the typing restrictions that I described before. So these typing restrictions essentially says that the parsing of the stream is unambiguous, and from that fact, it can be shown that there is only a bounded number of alternatives that need to be maintained simultaneously in order to be able to compute the output. And if I were to give a one-line summary of what this theorem says, it would be that StreamQRE has a very small overhead in order to parse the stream in a regular way and combine the intermediate results in order to give the final output. Another interesting aspect, I think, is that it is possible to incorporate approximation in the StreamQRE framework. So there are all these very trivial numerical aggregates like average, where the streaming algorithm is extremely obvious. You just maintain, let's say for average, the running sum and the running count. But what about more complicated aggregates like the median? So here it is known that in order to compute exactly the median in the streaming model of computation, you need space that grows linearly with the size of the stream. Right? Essentially, this says that we need to remember the multiset of all elements that have appeared so far. And this is very expensive to maintain. It consumes a lot of space. It's not something desirable in our setting. And the key insight here is that if we accept approximate answers, then we can do exponentially better. So let's say I fix an approximation constant epsilon, which is equal to 0.01. This corresponds to a relative error of 1%. Then the idea is that I place the numbers into buckets that are of exponentially increasing size. And instead of remembering the numbers, I remember the index of the bucket. So let's say my first bucket is from 1 up to 1 plus epsilon. My second bucket is from 1 plus epsilon to 1 plus epsilon squared. I place my numbers in the buckets, which is somewhat like discretizing my numbers into these exponentially increasing buckets. And now I can maintain an approximate histogram of all the numbers that have occurred so far, and the space I need to store this data structure is equal to log u over epsilon, where u is the range of the values. So this is one example of how approximation can give me an exponential saving in space. And I want to stress here that there are tons of other interesting small space algorithms for several computations, and they can all be incorporated in StreamQRE and freely used in conjunction with the other constructs. Okay, so we have all these theoretical guarantees, but what about the performance of StreamQRE on practical workloads? So we have implemented StreamQRE as a Java library, and we chose two benchmarks to compare: the Yahoo streaming benchmark and the so-called Nextmark benchmark that is about monitoring of an online auction system. And we also chose three popular streaming engines to compare to, namely RxJava, Esper for Java, and Flink. And the reason we chose those is because they all have actively maintained implementations, and they all expose a very rich API for stream processing. Now, I show the performance of all four engines on an example query on the Yahoo benchmark. It's a time-based window computation with nested key-based partitioning, where we compute every second the number of views associated with an ad campaign. And I plot on the diagram the throughput of each engine, and as you can see, StreamQRE performs relatively well compared to the competition. Now, this is a table that summarizes the experimental results for all queries that we implemented, and I show the relative slowdown of the other queries compared to StreamQRE. And here, the observation is that StreamQRE is consistently faster than ReactiveX, and it's much faster than both Esper and Flink. So to conclude, the main point of this talk is that StreamQRE is a small and expressive language for stream processing. It has a solid mathematical foundation in the theory of regular expression, and it can conveniently express many practical computations. Moreover, the StreamQRE engine has strong theoretical efficiency guarantees, and we have also validated experimentally the efficiency by comparison with other popular streaming engines. And I guess this is the end. Thank you.
Very nice. My understanding is something that tends to happen in practice with popular streams like Twitter or whatnot is that in addition to having a very big stream, you have thousands or tens of thousands of queries that you wish to combine. And it seems to me in the regular setting, you can naively combine them, no problem. But I'm wondering if you've thought about, optimizing sort of across queries as you merge multiple queries.
So this is a very good thought for further work. We haven't done that yet, and it's a very natural next step. But I think it requires some work to develop the theory within this framework of how you can combine several queries and share computation between those queries. And I think now it's completely open how this can be done in an expressive language like StreamQRE.
And we're running late, so we'll probably make this the last question.
So your experiments results are like very impressive. Do you know exactly what reason this is, or like how do you get such good performance compared to the others? Like what point of your language really makes the difference?
So I can tell you what we're doing right. I can't pinpoint what the other systems are not doing as well as they could. So a feature of our evaluation algorithm is that it maintains the minimal amount of state that is possible. So we don't do any buffering, and we eagerly perform all the quantitative operations. So the state that we maintain is the absolute smallest amount of state that we need in order to compute whatever is necessary for the future. We do no buffering whatsoever, so we just collapse everything that we can as soon as we can. And I guess this is the explanation that I would offer for the efficiency of the engine.